So welcome to this LSE IDEAS book launch for Professor He's book. And I'd like to start first by introducing myself. I'm Professor Chris Hughes, Professor Emeritus in the International Relations Department here at the LSE. And I'm really grateful to LSE IDEAS for organizing this on the 25th anniversary of the transfer of Hong Kong to China. And whatever your feelings about that transfer and what's happened since, and especially the last few years, and of course, most of us have very strong feelings about it, but we can all benefit from cool-headed, objective academic analysis and discussion. And the best place to start is definitely Professor Hong's new book. Here it is, City on the Edge, Hong Kong under Chinese rule. And it's the best place to start, but I think probably also the best place to finish because it covers just so much. And I won't say any more about it because we've got plenty of time to discuss it. And best of all, we have Professor He himself to present his book to us in person. And Professor He is professor in political economy at Johns Hopkins University. He's written very widely on Hong Kong and mainland China, covering a huge range of politics and economics. I won't say more about him because you can see the details on the website, and I want to leave as much time as possible for the presentations and discussions. We're also lucky to have two excellent discussants with us today. The first is Tanya Branigan, and all of us who have followed China over the past few decades will have followed her intrepid reporting from China during 7 years as China's correspondent for The Guardian, as a China correspondent for The Guardian. And now she's a leader writer for The Guardian. And I must say they've got some quite good coverage of Hong Kong in The Guardian today. So take a look at that too. And the other discussant is Dr. Chang, who is the director of the Center of Taiwan Studies at SOAS. And if you're not familiar with the Center of Taiwan Studies, please do get familiar with it because it's an incredibly lively, successful, I think the only really dedicated Center for Taiwan Studies in the world. And hopefully one day we'll have a Hong Kong Center, a Center for Hong Kong Studies as well, somewhere in this country. But Dr. Chang is an expert on identity politics, nation building, cultural politics, and theatre. And so she, of course, is also well versed to discuss many of the issues in Professor He's book. So I won't say any more because I'd like to hand over now to Professor He, and he's going to speak for about 15 minutes. Then the discussants will speak for about 7 minutes each, which will leave us about half an hour for Q&A. So you can put questions on the Zoom system and we can monitor them as they come in, and we'll come back to those after the presentation and the discussing. So over to you, Professor He, and thank you very much and welcome to LSE and LSE IDEAS.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you very much and LSE for organizing this event. And I have a lot of thanks to give, definitely. That thanks Cambridge University Press and for publishing the book, and many of my academic companions in and outside Hong Kong who work on Hong Kong that I benefit from and I cite in the book. So summarizing the book in 15 minutes is a challenge, but I try my best to give a kind of a teaser if you haven't read the book yet. So the core idea of the book is to try to explain then how and why we get to the uprising in 2019, and actually that when I start writing the book in fall 2019. The national security law was not there, and then it happened right when I'm writing the book. So I also expanded to include the how come Beijing react to the uprising in such a way, and to put it in a real long historical perspective. And for those of you who read the book, you know that the book started in the year 1197. Which is exactly 800 years before the sovereignty handover in 1997. What I see is that Hong Kong has been a vibrant place for millennia, if not even longer, sitting on the fault line in between two tectonic plates. That is, one is the land continental powers, which is different forms of Chinese empire, from the Song Empire, Ming Cheng Empire, now the reviving Chinese empire in the 21st century, and the maritime world. So 1197 is a Fisher uprising against the Southern Song dynasty, and so it run against the myth. They run against two myths. One myth is that before the British came to Hong Kong has nothing, it's a barren rock, but actually it's not the case. There's a lot of things going on, commerce, resistance, and repressions, and a lot of action going on before the British came. And post 1842 and post 1997, Hong Kong is basically a continuation of this very long history. And as places sitting on geological fault line usually encounter recurrent turmoil or earthquake or volcanic eruption, but at the same time, because of this instability, that these places sitting on fault line also enjoy fertile soil and agricultural productivity and very lively economic activities, like in Indonesia and Japan and many Hawaii, many places that's sitting on geological fault line. So I like to use this metaphor that Hong Kong is sitting on this geopolitical fault line between tectonic plates. On the one hand, there's the recurrent instability and turmoil, but at the same time, this kind of in-betweenness characters of Hong Kong give Hong Kong the kind of fertile cultural and economic social soils for a lot of things to happen. My argument is that it's partly pessimistic and partly optimistic in the long run, that because that the national security law is not going to be the end of this story. If we take a longer view, on the one hand, we see that the national security law is not something ad hoc reaction to the uprising. Many people now say that with this the radical confrontational protests in 2019, Beijing has no choice but to resort to this national security law to crack down on Hong Kong. But if you compare Hong Kong with Macau, where there were not many protests at all, if any, and let alone this kind of a radical confrontational protest, that they still established full control of Macau and wipe out the civil society and public sphere, free public sphere there, which is very small to start with. So this national security law style crackdown has been in the book since the beginning of the sovereignty handover. They're just waiting for the opportunity to strike or find an excuse to strike, and so I am arguing against the view that this kind of national security law is just like the ad hoc reaction to the uprising. For that matter, that I compared Beijing policy toward Hong Kong with Beijing policy toward Tibet in the 1950s, which is kind of forgotten in recent discussion. But in the 1980s, I take up Deng Xiaoping and a lot of key Chinese leaders actually talk a lot about Tibet when they explain the one country, two system. Of course, in the 1980s, that Beijing has been we established some kind of communication with Dalai Lama. It seems that Deng Xiaoping is on the way to be optimistically get Dalai Lama back to Tibet and to reestablish some kind of openness in Tibet. And it didn't end up very well, as in the late 1980s that Tibet flared up in resistance and uprising again, and the rest is history. But in the 1980s, that Beijing is actually quite open about it, to talk about that we did try one country, two system before in 1950s Tibet. But if we really look at the history of Tibet, you see actually a lot of parallel. That in 1951, there is this 17-point agreement between Beijing and the Dalai Lama government to allow the Tibetan elite to continue govern the place so far as they accept Chinese sovereignty. But it is really a kind of a tactic to buy time for Beijing to get ready for establishing direct rule. When it is not yet ready. It maintained this kind of a one country, two system structure, though it was not claimed so. And in the middle, that they established these parallel power structures, parallel with the Dalai Lama government, until the conflict escalated and there was an uprising in 1959. Actually, it is also it is 60 years before the 2019 uprising in Hong Kong. And then it was a failed uprising, and then direct rule was established. So it is a lot of parallel, and the playbook is quite similar, that Beijing has been trying to incorporate these places that they were not confident to establish direct rule to start with, and then they use this one country two system as a tactic to buy time. When they are ready, they strike and then establish direct rule. And also in many Chinese textbook, actually, I cited in my book, it is very interesting that they explicitly talk about this parallel between this CCP strategy to govern the frontier with the Chang dynasty native chieftain system, which is when the Chang Empire expand into a new place with this ethnic non-Han minority that they first establish indirect rule, allow the local elite to maintain their customs, maintain their way of life, maintain their power. But at the same time, they send in Han migrants to dilute the local population, and when they are ready militarily and administratively, they strike and then get rid of the native chieftain and establish direct rule. And then in many Chinese PRC textbooks about minorities governance, they consciously and explicitly talk about this parallel. And then in many of these textbooks, in one that I cite, published by the Guizhou Renmin Press, these kind of electionalities governance discussion is about the Mao area, the Yale area, and in the end that they talk about one country two system, talk about Hong Kong and Macau and even Taiwan. So it showed that Beijing has been consciously put this Hong Kong question and also Macau and the Taiwan question in the framework of this empire's governance of minorities areas. And so this national security is no surprise in this historical perspective. But as I said, that it is not the end of Hong Kong, or even the end of the resistance of Hong Kong. As you look at the case of Tibet and Xinjiang, this kind of a local oppositional identities against a bigger nation state or bigger empire, once it formed, it is very, very, I would say, sticky or lots of persistence, and it will stay on. And Tibet direct rule was established in 1959, and it was not, as we see now, as we know now, there is not the end of the resistance, and the resistance still just turned underground in the area and then flare up into open conflict at times over the years. And of course, a huge Tibetan diasporic communities is developing, and it's becoming more and more vibrant. Of course, that is the religious factors, that is a Dalai Lama factor. But you look at the case of Xinjiang, the Uyghurs people, is the same. And even look farther away or back in history, that after the KMT suppression of the Taiwan uprising in 1947, that the Taiwan opposition, as we now know, after the democratization, and a lot of people are going back to history, and in the 50s and 60s and 70s in the Right Terror, there's a lot of study groups and a lot of underground thing going on. It's just stay low. And when the time comes that they emerge again, and at the same time, it is kind of implicitly or explicitly connected to the overseas diaspora of Taiwanese as well. And the same happened after the Soviet crackdown of the Hungarian uprising and the Prague of Spring of Prague in the 68. So if we take a really longer term history, we really can be optimistic that this resistance and identities of Hong Kong and the yearn for freedom and liberty will stay on. We just need to be patient, and we just need to be carefully looking for signs and watching, and people need to adjust to a new mode of operation or existence in a more subtle and underground way, rather than this kind of open street protest. At the same time, the last point I want to talk about is that another part of the book that is the first two substantive chapter of the book is heavy on finance and economic. I try to point out that why Beijing worry about the 2019 uprising and what is so different between the 2019 uprising and the early one that, for example, the 2014 Occupy, is that in 2019, it's not only the radical young people on the streets, and there are enough signs pointing to the fact that there is a lot of elite discontent among the local Hong Kong Chinese business who are unhappy with the monetization of the business in Hong Kong and the deterioration of the business monopoly. So much so that Beijing need to revamp the Legislative Council election after the electoral security law, and even the functional constituencies, the business sector's influence in the Legislative Council has been reduced, and so it is this elite discontent, and of course they fall in line again under the electoral security law. It's going to stay on in a kind of more subtle way that Beijing is not going to be very free of anxiety about their loyalty, and Beijing will take no chance, and it is why that in the latest chief executive so-called election, that only one candidate is available, and then in the past that they try to put up a kind of a facade of establishment candidates competition among themselves. But this time they take no chance and didn't allow even that. And the chief executive is John Lee, is with a heavy police security background, which is not normal, even from a perspective of CCP picking provincial leader or city leader, that they usually will pick somebody with a civilian background to do this job, and with somebody with a heavy security police background is quite not normal, and it shows Beijing is still very anxious about keeping Hong Kong under control. So to conclude that, my book conclusion is really kind of open-ended. The only definite thing is that the story about Hong Kong, the vibrancy and the Hong Kong resistance is going to continue. It's going to stay on. Then we just need to take a longer view. If we only focus on the short term, that really it is very depressing. It is very pessimistic. But if we take it the longer term, we really can see that the thing will continue to unfold, and there is still a lot waiting for us. Thank you, and look forward to everyone's comments and questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor He. Tanya, will you go next? Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely fine. Thank you. So it's always a little bit daunting as a non-academic speaker in a room, even a virtual one, of academics. I'm very conscious that we're always the dilettantes, but perhaps what we can do is help to put things, to put academic works into a slightly broader perspective. I found this book extremely illuminating and thought-provoking, and of course, particularly reading it now at a moment where we've seen 2047 essentially arrive 25, 26 years ahead of schedule. What's striking is that as we have seen academic, journalistic, civil society space sort of crushed in Hong Kong, is that we're also seeing a flourishing of Hong Kong identity and a celebration, an embracing of that outside Hong Kong itself. As it becomes less and less possible there, it seems to thrive elsewhere, with this new imperative really to excavate and to preserve Hong Kong's culture and spirit and identity, that sense of what it was, what it is, and what it could be perhaps one day. So I think, for example, of some of the documentaries that we have coming out, which will be on show in London as elsewhere, or Karen Leung's memoir, Impossible City, and Louisa Lim's wonderfully reported book, Indelible City. They're obviously much more mainstream works, and yet I thought Lim's book in particular had a lot in common with Professor Hung's work. They're very engaged books that both, I think, address that question of how to be an independent observer while still feeling very much engaged in the subject, Above all, I think they remind us that perhaps we never really saw Hong Kong, even when we thought we did, that we've never really understood it in its own terms. And in particular, there's been a tendency to address the last sort of 100, 200 years of its history, rather than the centuries, as Professor Hung says, that sort of stretch back and which perhaps offer really a better understanding of what the place is. I think inevitably, very understandably, the focus has been on China's relationship with Hong Kong. And yet to understand that, we also really need to understand the history that's been obscured by the British view and assumptions and the British rhetoric, really, when it comes to Hong Kong. As Professor Hung said, this idea of a barren rock, when in fact it's very much a liminal place of rebels and outcasts. And I think the other sort of thing that comes through all of these works is that sense of hope, the idea that they're not just sort of eulogies or sort of historical records. As Professor Hung says towards the conclusion of the books, reports of Hong Kong's death are greatly exaggerated, and of course they have been made many times before in the past. So where I think the work sort of distinguishes itself is firstly, of course, in its academic depth, the depth of its research, as you would expect, but also in its breadth, in the way it seeks to place Hong Kong in the context of broader economic and geopolitical shifts. As it says, underlying the 2019 movement is a major tectonic shift in local society and in the global political economy. And without regarding those aspects, we can't really hope to understand what has happened. And so whilst recognizing and dissecting the unique circumstances and forces at play in Hong Kong, what I also found really helpful was the way that it looked at the way that Beijing regards Hong Kong within that context of broader territorial questions, Tibet, Xinjiang, as you've just discussed, one day, of course, Taiwan. And it's striking to me of how many protesters at the height of the 2019 movement themselves drew parallels with Xinjiang and saw that as being a kind of future for them, a kind of parallel for all the many huge differences. They saw something to identify with in what has happened there. Secondly, I found it very helpful in its sort of broader discussion of the relationship between nation states and cities, particularly in a globalized economy where cities have come to play a much more powerful role in some ways, and yet are sort of battling these sort of geopolitical forces. And also, I think above all, the sort of tension between the parties' need for Hong Kong as a sort of liminal entity with this different economy and legal situation and international status, but also the need to politically control it. And that, of course, is something that has become evident as part of a move towards increasing repression. We see a party state which has sought to expand and tighten its control domestically, and is increasingly suspicious of and hostile to outside influence. And it seems that for Beijing, liminality has really tipped from being something which is potentially useful to being something that is inherently perhaps dangerous and threatening. And of course, a party state which also feels emboldened to be forceful thanks to the decline and chaos it witnesses in the West, the inconsistencies and hypocrisies of Western foreign policy and so forth. And as all these forces play out, Hong Kong is really caught within them, caught within these perils and these possibilities. And I thought perhaps the way that Professor Hung summed it up most beautifully is when he said it's a place that's always on the edge of being annihilated and on the edge of breaking free. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanya. And so BU, Professor Chang.
Thank you.
Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Okay. I'm honored and delighted to be invited to this panel. Among all these really Hong Kong experts, I feel a bit of imposter syndrome creeping in. So when Lucas contacted me and asked me to join, I was not really sure that how I could contribute to this discussion. However, he persuaded me that I could approach this from a Taiwanese perspective. And I'm glad that I did. And thank you very much for introducing me to this beautifully written book. I have to admit, my idea about Hong Kong were very basic before reading this book. I understand its importance as one of the world's financial centers and see it as a place that has a fantastic cultural mix of the East and West. Or simply, if I may say so, a popular shopping destination. By reading this book, I have learned so much about Hong Kong, from its colonial past, the precarious present, and its difficulties ahead. And after finishing the book, and I told my colleagues that I was so inspired by the writing style, so fluid, that I would endeavor, I said, I would endeavor in the future to write much more fluid, less boring, clinical academic pieces, because it's really, you can see the passion of this book as well. It's a kind, almost like a love letter to his own hometown. Well, at least for me, I can see that. Thank you very much, Professor Hong. And putting my Taiwanese hat on, in the next few minutes, I will try to tease out some basic argument. I think you have already mentioned quite a lot. So I will really reflect on the lessons learned from Hong Kong's experience and ask a few questions. Really, it's the question I'm really more interested to put forward. So the book, like Professor Hong said, is organized into three parts. They actually work together into weaving into this kind of different kind of elements about the city and also about the people, and forming a really powerful discourse about this place. They all point to the resilience and uniqueness of Hong Kong. In other words, the book not only provides a deep reading of the city, the people, and its past struggles, but also in many ways shows a tender affection for and pays tribute to Hong Kong. So for me, the biggest takeaway from reading this book is the analysis of the one country, two systems model. I found this part most intriguing and extremely useful for me because it's quite fascinating to think about how Beijing deal with Hong Kong and Tibet, of course. So it's a sobering read to learn about the traumatic experience in Tibet, the seemingly familiar repeat in Hong Kong, and of course, the potential threat to Taiwan. So this book has not only presented a detailed account of the policy implementation, I think it's more important to look at how the analysis offered this kind of fascinating inside know-how into Beijing's tactics. So of course, the CCP today is not the same as the CCP under Mao. Hong Kong is not Tibet, and their local challenges are very different. However, the implementation of this model in Tibet and Hong Kong follows the same trajectory by offering seemingly preferential treatment to buy time, gradually replacing the local elite with Beijing supporters, and eventually shifting the local autonomy to central control by reinterpreting the concept of one country, two systems. The tactic reminds me of the so-called preferential treatment that Beijing offered to Taiwanese businesses, especially during the Ma Ying-jeou period. Also, it reminds me of the reformulation of the One China respective interpretation, 一个中国各自表述, to bring, in the attempt to bring Taiwan into its orbit. So it is clear, if Taiwan is not vigilant in asserting its sovereignty and safeguarding its autonomy, the island might easily fall into the similar trap. So this book gives us much food for thought. In some ways, the book itself is an embodiment, I would say, of Hong Kong resistance. It creates a more constructive discourse about Hong Kong's ability to survive external rulers and challenges the Beijing-led narrative of Hong Kong as a Chinese subordinate with declining significance. And I think this is really amazing achievement by reaching out, not just academic circle, but also to a general public. So in the last decade, Hong Kong has become increasingly relevant to the Taiwanese. Sharing a similar anti-Beijing sentiment, the majority of Taiwanese really support Hong Kong's struggle for democracy. The banner with the slogan, Hong Kong today, Taiwan tomorrow, can be found everywhere in Taiwan, especially in social movements. One of my Hong Kong students told me that he observed a lot of support for Hong Kong in Taiwan. However, the support, I wonder whether he's actually in the audience, but the support remained abstract, he said, and that means without substance. As you can imagine, this is because Taipei is caught between a rock and a hard place and has to remain ambiguous under the shadow of the Chinese threat. Even so, for the majority Taiwanese today, especially among the younger generation, Hong Kong has become a symbol of resistance against the authoritarian rule. Although Taiwan is only remotely referred to in the book, the development in Hong Kong has growing implication for and connections to Taiwan's future. Therefore, Hong Kong issues occupies a special place in the mind of the Taiwanese, and the Hong Kongers are regarded as a kind of comrades in arms. I don't know how much time I got left. I got two questions, if I may. One question. Okay. That's about Taiwan first. I will try to be quick. So I'm slightly surprised to find the absence of Taiwan in the book. And may I ask why that's the case? And also, what lessons you think Taiwan can learn from Hong Kong's Beijing experience? If I have more time later, I will have plenty of questions. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, BU. And thank you also, Tanya. I mean, there are a number of questions that you might want to come back to, Professor He, but I think I'd like to guide you a bit from what, focusing on one of the things that Professor Chang raised, which is the political economy side of this, which I found to be so important, so good in your book, and especially the business community, a business elite in Hong Kong, because we all look, there's a lot of work on the civil society movement, but this business elite is kind of shady, and you shed so much light on that. And I think when Professor Chang mentioned, you know, the issue of Taiwan and the sunflower movement there, which was against the trade in services agreement, and what would have happened if that had gone ahead, that agreement on allowing investment in services from the PRC into Taiwan. Surely there's a lot can be learned from the Hong Kong example, but also what really interested me was what you said about the indigenous Hong Kong business community and how they sided with Beijing initially and did quite well out of that, but then they got driven out, their interests were driven out by this influx from mainland China. And then they actually became quite supportive of the civil society movement in 2019. And I just wonder where that's leading now, whether those people are just going to leave Hong Kong or whether they're going to be a substantial force in this key issue of Hong Kong's economic situation as the link between China and the world. And maybe also, so we can let the audience get a say in here. So there's a question there, I think, for you, but it links in also with the first question that came up, which was from the audience. Do you think independence of Hong Kong from China, in quotation marks, is the only answer for Hong Kong democracy? Do you think there is any chance for Hong Kong independence? Now, you may want to say what your own view is, but I think more important is what your book says about that relationship between democracy and independence, and how the civil society movement has developed in Hong Kong since 1997, and that key issue of how do they deal with, does a democratic Hong Kong have to be independent or not? I mean, there are so many interesting things in your book where you look at how they've grappled with this problem of trying to advocate democracy while maybe not advocating independence, but then other people saying, no, we have to have independence. So maybe you'd like to respond to a few of those, pick and choose.
Yeah, thank you very much for all of your comments, and Tanya, Professor Chang, and Chris, that I have been following your works. I've been admiring your works for a long time, so it is really my honor to have your comments and kind words about my books, and to respond to a few of the issues that come up. Yes, that Hong Kong and Tibet comparison and Hong Kong Taiwan comparisons, they are comparable but not the same. That we also need to point out the key differences. And for example, though Beijing consciously used the Tibet playbook to establish its governance in Hong Kong, and then to slowly shift Hong Kong from an indirect rule to a direct rule model. But one key difference that many of you already point out is that this Hong Kong financial center role that Tibet didn't have back in the 1950s. In the 1950s, it is the whole consideration is geopolitical and political. And in Hong Kong, there is this financial economic consideration that we can already see the limit of the crackdown in the 2 years after the national security law in 2021 and now in 2022. That for example, it's very interesting that after this international response to the national security law by all these sanctions against Hong Kong and Chinese officials and entities in Hong Kong, and the Chinese government also enact a kind of foreign sanction law to basically to ban companies having operation in China to abide by the sanction rules in foreign countries, primarily the US. And in last year, that there has a lot of tough talk from Chinese officials and Chinese media about to extend this anti-foreign sanction law to Hong Kong. It seems at many points that it is inevitable that it will be applied to Hong Kong. But if it applied to Hong Kong, it will give all business in Hong Kong, including Chinese business with global exposure, a difficult time, because they have to make an impossible choice between abiding by US sanction, for example, and abiding by Chinese law. They cannot do both, so they have to choose whether you are with the US or with China. And then in the end, after it became a long reality, that there's a report actually saying that many Hong Kong business companies, including major Chinese banks, are lobbying against the application of the anti-foreign sanction law to Hong Kong. And then in the end, that in the last minute, in this last summer, 2021, that Beijing declared that they are suspending the discussion of applying the anti-foreign sanction law to Hong Kong, apparently yielding to the pressure of the business sectors lobbying. So it is the interesting thing that on the one hand, Beijing really suspect that there's some elite discontent behind the 2019 uprising, and the foreign financial sectors and foreign financial firms are at least they are sympathetic with the protesters, so they are going to be cracked down. And you read in the news a lot about the HSBC. Beijing is very unhappy about it in its role in the indictment of Meng Wanzhou and every other cases, but states still cannot go in full force in wiping out the space for this financial autonomy of Hong Kong. And there's plenty of other examples. The COVID control measure that they didn't go as far as like Shanghai, that is a whole citywide lockdown. It is really much in the air earlier in the year, when the surge of COVID. But in the end, that they didn't do it against because partially of the financial sector lobbying, and also they even shortened the quarantine period for the overseas travelers. So at the height of the 2019 protests and after national security law, there's a lot of talk about Hong Kong becoming a Liu Xinjiang. That the same kind of surveillance and control is going to be in place, but in the end, that it is Shanghai that the New York Times has an interesting article called it is Shanghai Xinjiang. So they in the end that Shanghai is supposed to be a rival financial center of Hong Kong. In the end, the subject to this kind of draconian control, and Hong Kong seems to have be spared out of it. So you see this Beijing dilemma about cracking down Hong Kong, but at the same time they're still hesitant to go too far to wipe out the remaining autonomous space, at least for the financial sector. So this kind of Hong Kong as an offshore financial center is still a kind of a thing that China or Beijing leaders do not know how to get around, because Hong Kong has its own currency and it's its own custom, is an independent custom territory. So it is the kind of a constraint on Beijing, and we will see a lot of this kind of a back and forth in the years to come. The next thing to watch is the internet, whether they shut down Hong Kong internet, disconnect it from Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and everything, Google, just like in mainland China. It's not yet. So this kind of a financial role of Hong Kong is still constraining Beijing action on Hong Kong. And of course, in terms of Taiwan, that I have more systematic reference to Taiwan with regard to the 1950s and 1960s when Mao Zedong is floating the one country, two system proposal to Chiang Kai-shek, but didn't talk a lot about Taiwan thereafter and here and there. But I should have talked more about it if I have more space in the book. But actually, it's very interesting to look at how the Hong Kong local identity, as I said, the Hong Kong local identity grew in the 1970s as a cultural identity, but it is never a political identity. And the political activists, even the opposition, they are staunchly Chinese nationalists, patriotic, if you may. But after 2000s, that there's this kind of a local political identity start to develop, and it is definitely has something to do with the fact that Taiwan shift to a DPP government in the early 2000s, and all this kind of Taiwan nationalist discourse start to be taken note of in Hong Kong. And I cite in a kind of ad hoc manner about this kind of a local community protest in the early 2000s. They adopt a lot of slogans and discourse from Taiwan, for example, to look at Hong Kong as a kind of a community of the same faith, and Mengyun Gongtongti, and it is definitely come from Taiwan, and also this kind of a repertoires of protests and localist identities and political discourse. So there's a lot of resonation that definitely Taiwan, from the shift from KMT to DPP rule under Chen Shui-bian and later Tsai Ing-wen, and then the Sunflower definitely has a lot to do with incubating the Hong Kong local identity as a political identity. Even that you look at the networks of people, that there's a lot of interchange of activists between the Taiwan social movement and the Hong Kong social movement. So there's a lot, and a new book waiting to be written. And of course, that already some Taiwan scholar already wrote about the connection between the Sunflower movement and the Occupy movement in 2014. But definitely, there's a lot more waiting to be explored. And to the last questions about this, whether independence and democracy go hand in hand, it is very difficult to predict what is going to happen in the next 10, 20 years. It all depends on the political development of China. Definitely, the one thing that we know for sure, which is inevitable, is that Xi Jinping cannot live forever. The situation of that, there's argument about whether Xi Jinping is upholding this institutionalization of authoritarian rule or undoing it. And in some way that he's undoing it in the sense that after Deng Xiaoping, the succession of leaders are institutionalized and there's a stability of policy and everything else. But Xi Jinping making himself a lifelong leader, turning China into a kind of a some regime ruled by a lifelong dictator has this strength in terms of upholding the stability of the regime, but also it instills new risk, because whenever you have this lifelong dictator, that usually when the lifelong dictator died, and it created kind of a succession crisis, unless that he make his son or daughter or whatever that to be the successor become a dynasty. Otherwise, that it could be instability. So when what can come out from this instability when he suddenly fall ill or died and things like that. So it is very unpredictable. So it all depends on what China will become in 10, 20 years times. But in terms of the future of Hong Kong, that I won't want to predict whether that it will be fully annihilated, become one really ordinary Chinese city, or become independent, or actually there's a possibility always that if they really couldn't solve the problem of maintaining China at Hong Kong as the offshore financial center, and it's so important because they want to internationalize the use of the renminbi, but at the same time they don't want to make renminbi fully convertible and open up China financial border, and then the solution is to use Hong Kong. And then if they couldn't solve this problem, that they I have a slight naive, not hope actually, but this like a possibility that they can go back to this one country two system in this original form. They maintain the space for that, but again, that it all depends. And just like when the British Empire dissolved in the mid of the 20th century, there's a lot of forms of continuous sovereignty in Falkland and Gibraltar, and there's some place that becomes self-governing but still under the Commonwealth or under the rule of the British monarch nominally, and there's some full independence. So even in this kind of 19th, 20th century, the Great Empire, when they end, that there's different forms of independence or autonomy or staying in the empire. So there's a lot of possibility, and there's a lot of different paths possible. So I don't want to make any prediction, but when we look back in 50 years, we will definitely see that actually there's the situation is much more fluid than we see it today. It seems like everything is that, but actually it is not. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. And we've got quite a few questions now, and a lot of them are on similar things that you kind of covered on the identity and so on, but there are a couple which are on the broader geopolitics, which you do cover in your book too. So I think maybe we can address those because we've only got about 10 minutes left. So we'll address those first. And one of them is, I'll read it out. Professor He rightly referred to parallels between the PRC treatment of Tibet in the 50s and Hong Kong in the recent past. It's important not to forget Tibet and so on. But my question is, after Tibet, we saw Hong Kong's freedoms being crushed, and next on PRC's target is Taiwan. Do you think the PRC will remain satisfied after this, or do you see them getting more and more aggressive in the wake of their increasing military and economic might? And the other question, which is similar, is how do you think the situation with Ukraine and Russia's aggression affects the China approach to Hong Kong and Taiwan? So, you know, where is China going after Hong Kong and Taiwan, essentially?
Yeah, definitely. It is very interesting and somewhat troubling situation there that I have been talking to people in the media asking me what the implication of Hong Kong crackdown to Taiwan again and again over the years. And the sad answer is that in the beginning, in the late 1990s and early 2000s in Beijing, when it deal with Hong Kong, they really have Taiwan in mind to see Hong Kong as a demonstration effect to the people in Taiwan to make them eventually accept one country, two system of some kind. But over the years, I think Beijing is not totally out of touch. They know that their identity in Taiwan, the opposition is Taiwan, is very strong, and also the national security risks from the view of Beijing in Hong Kong is so grave that when they do the crackdown of national security law in 2019, they really don't bother the thing about Taiwan implication anymore, and they if not totally, but mostly, I think they already give up hope of using Hong Kong as a kind of example to show to Taiwan, and they are tilted toward more and more kind of who has the muscles and who will win in the end, rather than winning heart and mind. And we just they just moving toward a more and more military, or at least quasi-military solution to Taiwan, not necessarily a full-scale invasion, but military intimidation. That is the sign showing as the examples of Putin's view on Ukraine shows that really military option is a kind of a pathway forward that Beijing definitely will observe very carefully. What is happening in Ukraine in the beginning, it seems like Putin is getting a lot of resistance, and there's a unification among the world really against this kind of aggression. But it all depends on how it plays out in the end. In the long run, maybe the international solidarity supporting Ukraine might dissolve, or at least among the Europeans, and maybe they will stay on. That we can't tell for sure right now. And maybe in the end, the Ukraine will survive and prevail, maybe not. And so the kind of end game of Ukraine, which is going to be long grinding, is going to shape Xi Jinping calculation. Of course, that the good news is that invading Taiwan from Beijing is much more difficult in comparison to Putin invading Ukraine, that is separated by a land border, and then kind of the Taiwan Strait is much more difficult to get over. But the other thing that my book talk about Hong Kong that has some implication, a lot of implication actually to Taiwan, is that this kind of CCP infiltration into the Hong Kong civil society that has been going on since the 1970s to infiltrate the elite and infiltrate the building united front with not only the activists and who are disillusioned with colonial rule, but also many of the allies of the colonial governments and all the elites, that they have been laying the groundwork and developing their networks. And then when the time comes, these people just will emerge from nowhere and become very prominent in supporting Beijing policies and shifting opinions in the civil society. So this kind of infiltration work has been must be going on also in Taiwan and in other overseas society. One interesting thing is that Chang that I cite a lot, and many people take notice that he is the #1 very important think tank person in China regarding Hong Kong policy, and he has been writing about Hong Kong, and that his writing turned to be policy. And then most recently, he wrote a piece saying that Beijing governance of Hong Kong is a kind of a very important laboratory or experimental ground for Beijing to learn how to control global capitalism, actually. So it is very interesting that if Tibet playbook make Beijing know how to wipe out a local government and incorporate the new territory, establish direct rule there, then Hong Kong that can offer to Beijing is to learn how to ride on global capitalism. Basically what he's talking about is this foreign companies, local capital and global capital, and through the laboratory of Hong Kong. So definitely that Beijing learned a lot from that, and so that Beijing control of Hong Kong won't end there. And then people point out the Taiwan is next, but actually not only Taiwan. And you see that and Zhang Xigong wrote about that Hong Kong is a kind of a liberal society with liberal civil society and some political structures, and Beijing working in there enable Beijing to learn how to navigate and how to eventually take control of this liberal democratic representative institutions and society. And then you see that they are doing the same United frameworks and infiltrations and activities in many has been written about Australia, New Zealand, and other liberal societies. And so this is the thing that the Taiwan implication of Hong Kong is great, but also the Hong Kong implication to the rest of the world, the liberal democracies is very, very, very important as well.
Thank you very much. I think we've got time for one last question we can just squeeze in, which actually links. I'd like to choose one that links in with what you've just finished on, which is from Ho-fung Lau. I won't read out the whole question because it's quite long, but the interesting part of it is about Hong Kong people seem to have no problem for abandoning Hong Kong, especially after the launch of B&O Visa and similar projects that so many people have left. Does that show that the CCP's tactics are successful? I'd like to kind of add to that, you know, one issue I found with the book where maybe you should address is the huge number of people that pass through Hong Kong, you know, and if you look at the population and how it's changed since the early 20th century, and the huge number of people that have come from mainland China into Hong Kong, despite Hong Kong's own identity, but also that some of the people you mentioned who led the democracy movement were born in mainland China, you know, as children, and they came to, and so there's this kind of looking at where people are now and the number of people who are coming. We're very lucky and to have them in this country and other countries. Are you optimistic about change? You know, this was another question in there, you know, or it does this show actually that the CCP strategy works? You just get rid of people, or is it part of a bigger sort of network that still has some traction in Hong Kong? And I know you do address that in the book, so maybe we can finish on that.
Yeah, they always want to get rid of people, but they can never really get rid of people. Identity and memory is a very long-lasting thing that in a short moment of weeks or months or year that we might fret that the layman that this identities or memories is lost and people live and have a live life, but it will come back. And then as we can see in the case of Xinjiang and Tibet, and have been China successfully established a direct route there for more than half a century, but this identity and resistance and memories and the stubbornness stay on. And let alone the Taiwan after 1947, it seems that everything is in place and everything is stable, but under the surface, we only discover it after the democratic transition. We know that so much is going on the ground actually, and the same in Eastern Europe and all these kind of Soviet satellite states under the communist rule. And definitely many people left, just as after 1959, and there's a kind of a constant stream of people leaving Tibet. But these overseas Tibetans, whether they are loyal follower of Dalai Lama or not, or they are secular or not, that they, after they go overseas, if not immediately, that they actually rediscover and strengthen their identities as Tibetans, and these diasporic identities can be actually even stronger than back home, that you don't realize that your distinctiveness until you are in the different cultures. And definitely that there's a lot of examples of diaspora and nationalism that developing out of the diaspora community that end up in the nation building projects, and Israel is one example, and there's many other examples there. So that I don't think, if we take a longer term perspective, that these people living in Hong Kong will lead to a dissolution of these identities and memories and resistance. And there are a lot of people still in Hong Kong. We don't see a lot of things on the surface. That there's my favorite scene of a favorite movie, the 10 Years, the Hong Kong movie, which is prophetic about, it was made after the Occupy movement in 2014, and then it talked about what Hong Kong will become in 10 years. It became prophetic. It actually, that many of the prediction realized. But one favorite scene is that this kind of a draconian, ridiculous control that you cannot say the word local, and then in the end, in that episode, that in the end there's a secret libraries that the kids lead the adults to go into a secret library where people keep all these kind of forbidden things about Hong Kong, local identity, and there's a lot of people there. So I think this kind of thing is going to happen, that people stay in Hong Kong, choose to stay in Hong Kong, they remain silent on the surface, but I'm sure that as we know for many historical examples in Eastern Europe and in Taiwan, in the White Terror and everything everywhere else, that this kind of a space is going to continue. We just don't easily notice them. But when the time comes, it will flare up into more open expression and change, and the time will come, that I'm sure.
Perfect. You finished exactly on time, and thank you very much indeed. And there's a lot of other questions there, and we haven't got time, but I can say I've read the questions and the answers are all in Professor Hong's book. So do buy it, because it really does answer all those questions. It's an amazing book. There's so much in it, and it does also draw attention to the big geostrategic issues that are going on. And I would say anything could happen at the moment. Look what happened with the end of the Cold War and so on. When you get these massive international changes that we're living through, then it's very hard to predict what happens. So the more information we have, the more objective academic analysis, the better. And this is the book to buy. But we've run out of time now, so let me say thank you very much to Professor He, to Tanya Branigan and Chang for acting as discussants. This has been wonderful. And we're all going to be following events in Hong Kong very, very carefully. So thank you. And I think we have to finish on that note. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.